The Hidden Debt Trap: How Microloans and Buy Now, Pay Later apps Turned Small Purchases into Financial Control. Financial story. The name on her payroll portal still read Aisha Jackson, but after everything began unraveling, she stopped feeling like it belonged to her in any meaningful way. It had become a label attached to a profile, and the profile was no longer something she fully controlled. The name still showed up in the corner of every screen she logged into, formal and unbothered, while underneath it, some other version of her was being assembled out of numbers she had never agreed to produce. It was subtle at first, the way systems began talking to each other. There was no announcement, no single update that arrived with a warning. The change came the way water finds a basement, quietly and from several directions at once, so that by the time you notice the dampness, you cannot say which crack let it in. She noticed it one morning when she logged into her banking app and saw a new section she didn't remember agreeing to. It wasn't just transactions anymore. It was labeled Financial Behavior Insights. Under it were categories she didn't recall authorizing: essential consumption, flex spending, deferred obligations, and short-cycle liabilities. The words had the smooth, sanded quality of language designed by committee, each one chosen to sound neutral, each one carrying a verdict underneath. At first, she assumed it was just another analytics feature. Apps did that now. Everything was insights. Every service wanted to show her a pie chart of herself, to reflect her spending back at her as though she had asked to be studied. She had grown used to ignoring those. They were usually wrong, in harmless ways, lumping her coffee in with her commute, calling a one-time expense a habit. But when she clicked into it, she felt something tighten in her chest. Every microloan app she had used was now cross-linked. Every pay-later purchase, no matter how small, was being aggregated, categorized, and scored. Not just tracked individually, but interpreted as behavior patterns. The $40 she had split into 4 payments for a pair of work shoes. The grocery order she had deferred during a tight week in February. The phone bill she had smoothed across a pay cycle. None of it had felt like borrowing at the time. It had felt like managing. Now it was all sitting in one place, lined up in a row, presented back to her as evidence. It wasn't just showing what she owed. It was showing what kind of borrower she was becoming. There was even a number at the top, not labeled credit score, but something softer, more ambiguous. Liquidity Reliability Index. The phrase was almost soothing, the way a euphemism is soothing, and that was exactly what unsettled her about it. A credit score, she understood. A credit score had rules, disputes, a process. This was something else. This was a judgment wearing the costume of a metric. She stared at it longer than she cared to admit. It wasn't terrible. That was the worst part. It wasn't bad enough to panic over immediately. It was just low enough to quietly restrict her future options. If it had flashed red, if it had said denied, she would have known to fight. Instead, it sat there in a calm gray font, reasonable, almost friendly, the kind of number that does not invite an argument because it does not announce itself as a decision at all. That same afternoon, she tried to place a small grocery order. Nothing unusual. Bread, fruit, milk, a frozen meal for later in the week. When she reached checkout, one of her usual pay later options was gone. In its place was a message. Based on your current repayment activity, deferred payment options are temporarily limited. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. It felt automated in a way that didn't require human judgment anymore. There was no one to call, no one who had decided this about her specifically. Somewhere a threshold had been crossed and a rule had fired, and the rule did not know her name, even as it rearranged her week. The system had already decided what she was. That was the beginning of the escalation. Within a week, more options started disappearing. First, the larger purchase limits, then certain categories entirely. Household essentials were still available, but food delivery shifted to upfront payment only. Then, even small installment plans changed structure. What used to be 4 payments became 2, then 1. Each reduction felt insignificant on its own, but together they rebuilt the way she interacted with every basic need. She found herself doing arithmetic she had never done before, not the arithmetic of how much something cost, but the arithmetic of when and how she was permitted to pay for it. The price of a thing had become the least important number attached to it. She started noticing something else too. Timing mattered now. Orders placed in the morning had different repayment terms than those placed at night. Some apps adjusted fees based on risk windows, which were never fully explained. She only learned this because a customer support agent, exhausted and half apologetic, accidentally told her during a chat that the system updates behavioral pricing in real time. Behavioral pricing. She sat with that phrase longer than she should have. She turned it over the way you turn over a word you have said too many times until it stops sounding like a word. The idea inside it was simple and total. It meant the price was not a property of the thing she was buying. The price was a property of her. 2 people could open the same app at the same minute and be quoted different terms, and the difference would not be the product. The difference would be them. She thought about how a market was supposed to work, the version she had been taught in a high school economics class she barely remembered, where a price was a meeting point, a public fact that applied to everyone who walked up to the counter. That was gone now. There was no counter. There was only her and a quote built specifically for her, generated in the half second between tapping and seeing, and there was no way to know what anyone else was being shown. At work, things were shifting as well. The company she worked for had rolled out a new partnership with a financial wellness platform. It was presented as a benefit. Budgeting tools, emergency wage access, debt smoothing, all integrated directly into payroll. The announcement had a bright illustrated banner, 2 cartoon hands cupping a small green plant, and a tagline about putting employees first. The email from HR was polished and reassuring. We are committed to supporting employee financial flexibility. Aisha almost ignored it. She had already signed up for enough systems that promised flexibility and delivered something else. She had learned that flexibility in the mouths of these platforms rarely meant that she had more room to move. It usually meant that they did. But then she saw the part she couldn't ignore. Opt-in required for continued participation in early wage access and installment repayment coordination. She had already been using wage access as a backup. Now it wasn't just optional convenience, it was becoming part of payroll infrastructure itself. The tools she had reached for in an emergency had quietly stopped being tools she reached for and started being the ground she stood on. To refuse the new platform was not to stay where she was, it was to lose something she already depended on. If she didn't opt in, she risked losing access to income smoothing tools she had already integrated into her life. So she clicked accept. It felt like consent, but not like choice. The 2 had drifted apart somewhere along the way, quietly, the way the categories had appeared in her banking app, and she could not point to the moment when agreeing had stopped meaning wanting. That was when things started to blur together. Money stopped behaving like money. It became a series of overlapping systems reacting to each other. One system would reduce her liquidity score. Another would adjust her repayment windows. A third would change how much of her paycheck was available on any given day. She had always thought of money as a noun, a thing you had or did not have, a number in an account that sat still until you moved it. Now it behaved like a verb, like weather, like something that happened to her rather than something she held. She would check a balance in the morning and check it again at noon, and the relationship between the 2 numbers would not make sense. Not because money had left, but because the rules governing what the money meant had shifted underneath it. And all of it was happening in increments so small she couldn't point to a single moment where everything changed. There was no envelope in the mail, no stamped notice, no conversation across a desk. There was only the slow accumulation of adjustments, each one too minor to fight, each one defensible on its own, the whole of it amounting to something she would never have agreed to if it had been presented as a single proposal. Until something did. It started with rent. Her landlord used a digital payment system now, one that also offered optional installment splitting for tenants. She had never used it before, but that month she considered it. Just for breathing room, a small cushion, a few days of give, the kind of thing that would have been a phone call and a favor in an earlier era and was now a button. When she opened the option, the system paused. It took longer than usual to load. She watched the little wheel turn and felt, absurdly, that she was being looked at, that somewhere a process was reading the whole of her before answering. Then a message appeared. You are currently ineligible for installment splitting on essential housing payments due to outstanding micro-obligations across linked financial services. She reread it 3 times. It wasn't a denial. It was a classification. She wasn't being told she couldn't split rent because she lacked income. She was being told she couldn't because of how she had used other systems. The shoes, the groceries, the phone bills smoothed across a cycle. None of those had anything to do with her rent, with her landlord, with the roof over her head. And yet they did now, because everything had been wired to everything else, and a small decision made in one room of her life had walked into another room and locked a door. Her behavior elsewhere was now determining her access to housing flexibility. That night, she sat in her apartment with the lights off longer than usual. The streetlight outside laid a long, pale rectangle across the floor, and she watched it without really seeing it. It wasn't panic yet. It was something quieter, a realization forming slowly that she was no longer dealing with separate financial tools. She was inside one connected system that treated every decision as part of a single profile. And that profile was tightening. The real turning point came without warning. She woke up one morning to find her account partially frozen. Not locked, not blocked, just restricted in layers. The distinction mattered because a locked account is an emergency, and an emergency demands a response. This was not an emergency. This was a tightening, a narrowing, the kind of thing that does not give you anything to push against. She could see her balance, but couldn't move it freely. Some transfers required clearance. Some payments were delayed. Even small purchases triggered verification steps that hadn't existed before. The money was hers, technically, visibly, sitting right there on the screen. It simply no longer did what she told it to do without first asking permission of something she could not see. A notification explained it in neutral language. Temporary liquidity controls have been applied due to elevated fragmentation of outstanding obligations. Fragmentation, that word again. It made her debt sound like something broken rather than something owed. It carried no blame and offered no remedy. You cannot repay fragmentation. You cannot call someone and settle it. It was a description of a state, hers, and it had been applied to her account like a weather advisory, as though her own financial life were a region experiencing conditions. At work that day, she struggled to focus, not because she was distracted, but because she was constantly checking her phone. Notifications were arriving in waves now. Small adjustments, payment reschedules, updated repayment windows. Her phone buzzed against the desk, and each time something in her stomach dropped a half-inch before she even looked, a small Pavlovian flinch she was developing without consent, the same way she had developed everything else. One message stood out more than the rest. Payroll interception adjustment applied. She froze. She didn't understand it at first, not fully. The words were arranged in the same calm gray font as everything else, the font that had announced her grocery limits and her housing classification, and for a moment she tried to read it as something minor. But by the time she logged into her employee portal, she saw it clearly. A portion of her paycheck had already been redirected before it hit her account, not by HR manually, by the integrated financial system tied to her wage access and microloan activity. The money had been taken out of the river before the river reached her. She had spent her whole working life thinking of a paycheck as the beginning of a sequence, the thing that arrived and then got divided. Now the dividing happened upstream, in the dark, and what reached her was already a remainder. She hadn't been notified in advance, only after it happened. That was when she went to HR. The meeting was scheduled quickly, almost too quickly. The tone of the invitation was calm, professional, standard procedure. The speed of it unsettled her more than a delay would have, because it suggested that this was a path the company had walked before, that there was a room and a script and a slot on a calendar already shaped to hold a conversation like this one. When she arrived, the HR representative already had documents open on a screen. Not printed. Everything was digital now. The representative was younger than she expected, with the careful, slightly rehearsed warmth of someone who had been trained to deliver difficult information without owning any of it. They explained it like it was normal. There are automated repayment agreements tied to your enrolled financial services, the HR representative said. Some of your wage has been pre-allocated according to those terms. Aisha stared at them. I didn't authorize my paycheck to be taken before I see it. You did, they replied gently. It was included in your enrollment for wage access and installment coordination services. She felt something shift in her stomach. Not anger yet, not fear. Confusion that was starting to turn sharp. The worst part of the answer was that she could not prove it wrong. Somewhere, in some scroll of terms she had thumbed through on a small screen during a hard week, she had touched a button that meant this. The consent was real. The consent was also nothing like understanding, and the gap between the two was where she now lived. She asked for details. They showed her. A web of linked services. Not just apps she had used, but systems those apps were connected to. Third-party lenders, payroll integration partners, repayment processors, data sharing agreements she had clicked through months earlier without reading in full. The representative scrolled and scrolled, and the diagram kept opening outward. Boxes connected to boxes, arrows running between names she had never heard of. And at the center of all of it, small and ordinary, was her. Everything was legal. Everything was authorized, but none of it had ever been explained as a single structure. It had been presented as separate conveniences, a button here, a checkbox there, each one solving a small problem in a moment when she did not have the luxury of reading carefully. No one had lied to her. That was almost the hardest thing to absorb. No one had needed to. The truth had simply been distributed across so many screens and so many months that no single person, including her, had ever been required to hold the whole of it at once. That was the illusion. By the end of the meeting, she understood something she didn't want to understand. She wasn't late on payments in the traditional sense. She was inside a system that continuously reclassified her income before she could fully access it. She was not failing to keep up. There was no race she could win, because the finish line was being redrawn faster than she could move, by a process that had no finish line at all. Only the ongoing work of sorting her, again and again, into the category she happened to occupy that day. That evening, she tried to simplify everything. She sat down with her laptop and a notebook, an actual paper notebook, as though the analog act of writing might give her purchase on something the screens kept sliding out of reach. She attempted to list every service she had ever used, but she couldn't keep up. Accounts kept unlocking memories of other accounts. One app led to another. One repayment plan led to 3 more she didn't realize were still active. Some were dormant but still accruing fees. Others were paused but not closed. She would write down a name and then remember that the name had been bought by another company, which had merged with a third, which now operated under a brand she had seen advertised on a bus. It was like trying to trace water through cracks in glass. You could follow one line for a while, certain you understood its path, and then it would split, or vanish, or rejoin some other line you had already crossed off, and you would realize the whole surface was fractured in a pattern too fine to map. And every crack led somewhere deeper. By midnight, the notebook page was a mess of arrows and crossed-out names and question marks, and she understood that the document she was trying to make could not exist. The system was not a list. A list could be finished. The system was a living thing that rearranged itself, and any map she drew of it would be out of date before the ink dried. The escalation peaked when she received a call, not a notification, a real call, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. The phone sat buzzing on the table, and she looked at it the way you look at a knock at the door late at night, with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether they can pretend not to be home. But she did. It was a collections coordinator, not aggressive, not hostile, calm in a way that felt rehearsed, the same trained warmth she had heard in the HR office, the customer service register that has been engineered to lower your blood pressure precisely so that you will agree to things. They weren't calling about a large debt. They were calling about multiple small ones that had now been bundled into a recovery profile. The total wasn't extreme. That was the strange part. If they had called her about a single overwhelming sum, she would have known how to feel. There is a kind of dignity in a large debt, a clarity. This was the opposite. This was 100 small things swept into a pile, none of them frightening alone. The pile itself given a name and a case number and a person whose job was to call her about it. It was the structure that mattered. We're seeing repeated short-cycle defaults across integrated platforms, the caller said. Your profile has been flagged for coordinated repayment restructuring. Coordinated repayment restructuring, she asked what that meant. The answer wasn't simple. The caller used several more phrases like the first, each one smooth and total, and Aisha listened the way you listen to someone reading you a contract you have already signed, knowing the words are not really an explanation, but a recitation. It meant her debts were no longer being managed separately. They were being consolidated into behavioral enforcement. If she missed one micropayment, it affected her access to another system. If she adjusted her payroll settings, it affected her repayment timeline elsewhere. Every part of her financial life was now tied together through cascading dependencies. Pull one thread, and 3 others tightened. She had spent months trying to be careful, paying this to protect that, and only now did she understand that there was no move that did not cost her somewhere else. That the board had been arranged so that every direction was a kind of surrender. The caller didn't sound cruel, just procedural, like this was standard now, like she was the 7th such call before lunch, which she probably was. After the call ended, she sat in silence for a long time. The phone screen dimmed and went black, and she did not pick it up. This wasn't debt anymore. It was architecture. Debt was something you stood outside of and owed into. This she stood inside of. It had walls. It had load-bearing decisions she had made without knowing they would hold anything up. She lived in it now, and the rent on it was paid automatically before she ever saw the money. The next few weeks felt like compression. Her financial life narrowed in real time. She could almost feel the walls of it drawing closer, not in any single dramatic moment, but as a constant low pressure, the way altitude presses on the ears. Spending options reduced, payment methods changed, access windows shifted without warning. Even basic purchases became conditional. She started planning her days around system behavior instead of her own needs. She woke, and the first thing she did was not think about what she wanted, but about what she was permitted, and in what order and at what hour the permission would be cheapest. If she bought groceries at the wrong time, fees increased. If she waited too long, availability changed. If she tried to consolidate payments, penalties appeared. She learned the moods of the system the way a sailor learns weather, not because she wanted to, but because survival required it. And she hated that she was getting good at it, that some part of her was adapting, that the thing meant to serve her had instead trained her. Everything was reactive. Nothing was stable. At work, her manager noticed again, not directly, just patterns. Missed focus, short responses, delayed productivity. The very thing she had enrolled in to keep her life from falling apart was now visibly making it fall apart, and the failure was registering, quietly, in the place where it could do her the most additional harm. HR suggested another wellness check-in. She almost laughed at the word wellness. It had joined flexibility and insights and smoothing in the growing vocabulary of words that had been hollowed out and refilled with their opposites. But she went. This time, the conversation was different. The HR representative, the same young one, closed the laptop partway through. It was a small gesture, and she noticed it. They admitted quietly that several employees were experiencing similar issues with integrated financial tools. Not identical cases, but similar structures. It's becoming more common, they said. We're trying to understand the system better ourselves. For the first time, the rehearsed warmth slipped, and underneath it was something that looked like ordinary human tiredness, the face of a person who had read the same terms she had and understood them no better. That was the moment it stopped feeling like her personal failure and started feeling like something larger, something designed. Not designed against her specifically, which would almost have been a comfort. Designed without her in mind at all, the way a flood is not aimed at the house it takes. She had simply been standing in the path of a structure built to extract, and the structure had done what it was built to do. The resolution didn't arrive cleanly. There was no single payoff moment. No dramatic escape, no villain to confront, no executive in a tall building she could name and blame, no document she could tear up. The thing she was fighting had no face and no center, and you cannot win a battle against something that will not stand still long enough to be a battle. Instead, there was slow disentanglement. She began closing accounts one by one, even when it hurt financially in the short term. She accepted temporary instability to regain control over structure. She moved away from systems that linked income to repayment automation. Each decision was a small loss she chose on purpose, which was, she realized, the first thing in a long time that had felt like choosing at all. It took months. Each closure came with consequences. Some accounts penalized early exit. Some required final settlements recalculated at higher rates. Some simply resisted closure until balances were fully resolved, presenting her with new fees that existed, as far as she could tell, only to make leaving as expensive as staying. She paid them anyway. She thought of it as buying back pieces of herself, one overpriced fragment at a time. But piece by piece, the web loosened. Her paychecks stopped being intercepted. The first full deposit landed in her account, the whole number, undivided, and she stared at it with a feeling that was not quite joy. It was closer to recognition, the way you recognize your own face after a long illness. Her bank account stopped fragmenting in real time. The notifications slowed, and then, eventually, stopped. What remained was not relief exactly. It was awareness. Because even after everything stabilized, she could still see how easily it had all formed. She could see it everywhere now. The way you cannot unsee a face hidden in a pattern once someone has pointed it out. In every cheerful banner promising flexibility. In every checkbox at the bottom of a screen. In every friend who mentioned, lightly, that they had just started using one of the apps, just for a tight month, just for breathing room. Nothing had been hidden. It had just been distributed across apps, across agreements, across small decisions that never felt important at the time. The genius of it, if you could call it that, was that it never required a single moment of deception large enough to notice. It only required that no one ever be shown the whole. Months later, she explained it to someone at work who was considering one of the same apps. A new hire, young, capable, holding her phone with the app already open, the green plant and the cupped hands glowing on the screen. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. She had learned that dramatizing it was the surest way to be dismissed, that the calm of the system was best answered with the calm of her own. She just said, carefully, "It doesn't feel like debt when it starts. That's the problem." The new hire half smiled, the polite smile of someone who has already decided, and said something about just using it for a little while, just until things evened out. Aisha nodded. She understood. She had said the same words once, in the same tone, to no one, alone in her apartment, on the night the categories first appeared. And then she went back to her desk, carrying something she couldn't unsee anymore. How quickly convenience becomes structure, and how structure, once built from enough small pieces, stops feeling optional at all.